Yeah. Okay. Not a huge crowd.
I know. You're gonna have to reteach us.
I have to reteach it maybe. I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna forget it.
Well, I studied this already and it was really fun. So let's see. How do we kill this?
Home button, the white, down.
This one?
No, down on the bottom, under by the pins.
Oh yeah?
You see the board, the center of the board?
Yeah.
White button that's lit up.
Down there.
Oh, this one.
That one.
That one goes to it?
And then
Oh.
you choose your.
That'll work. We had the dialogues. There's the three dialogues that follow the Last Supper or the incident, the eating, the thing. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and the disciples went in. So remember, they've identified this, and Jesus is talking to God. Jesus is talking to the disciples. I think it's all part of the same dialogue, and that's okay. However you want to look at it is all right. If you remember, in the ancient world, people did not pray silently. That was considered really odd. And so you prayed aloud. So anytime you were speaking, you probably could be praying. The Greek does not use any of those words. We'll see if it does in here, because our NIV gives us this. Here's the Greek, and here is the King James. Jesus had spoken these words. Wait. The NIV the King James already told us what it really is. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forward with the disciples over the brook Cedron, and was a valley into which he entered his disciples. I want to make sure you know where all that is. This is what I love about being able to teach it this way with electronics. I just bring in the pictures. It's probably totally, I could never publish the book, but that's okay. We get pictures, which is really good. And I go through to find the best looking pictures, or the best pictures that look about accurate. Or if they're inaccurate, that's always fun too, because we can point out the differences. These, he said, Jesus, he came or went together to the learners, the disciples of him, over on the other side of the winter torrent, the Kidron, where was a garden into which he came, he and the learners of him. And you notice the word is Ipon, he said, so there's no praying going on according to the Greek. Now, let's see. Here's a translation. It said in English, Jesus said these, he went out together to his learners over on the other side of the winter torrent of the Kidron, where was a garden into which he came into, he and his learners, his disciples. The really cool stuff about this that we miss, you notice, look at what the King James, now the NIV isn't much different, but you notice what they said. The King James gives us the proper tense at least. So Jesus, this word, Ipon, is past tense in said, and it's always used for past tense. So in the present tense, the Greeks, when you have a present tense, like a dialogue present tense, the Greeks want to tell you, is this an utterance? Is this a story? Is it a rime? Is it an opinion? Is it a logical argument, right? We get that specific. But whenever it's said in the past, it's just said. Now, you might ask yourself the question, I think this is really interesting in tautology or in language. So when I'm speaking present tense to you, they want to clarify how it's being said, right? The way in which the words are being done. In the past tense, though, it's always said. Now, if you think about that in a logical fashion, if I'm talking to you, let's say I'm doing a logical argument to you. My logical argument may be filled with lots of words, but then I condense that those many words, those paragraphs and paragraphs, into a pithiness, right? Into a very logical, reasonable saying, or a story, right? Instead of, if I painted, remember Crane, Pastor Crane always talking about painters versus pointers and painters, right? I thought that was really interesting. You have people that paint you a picture, paint you a story, right? And those who just give you the main points. And in the Greek, obviously, when you're saving money, when you're writing stuff down, you want to be as pithy as possible, right? As much of a pointer as possible, because you can't afford to make it into a huge painting. So I just think it's interesting. The past tense is always said, and that's a correct translation, but in the present tense, it's really important to the Greeks to give you the way in which it's done. The other thing that's really cool about this is, look, the King James calls it a brook, the Kidron Brook, which is, I'll show you where the map is, but the word in the Greek is winter torrent. So it's not a brook, it's a winter torrent, which also tells us the time, right? This is near Passover. It's, when the winter waters would flow through it, and there was a garden. So we get a lot more details. We get a lot of details in John that we don't get in the other Gospels. And here I've got some stuff. Here's the translation for brook. It's a storm runlet, a winter torrent, a brook from the Greek. And, flowing in winter, a torrent, which is really, in my opinion, different than a brook. But whatever. I think it's funny how our translators decide to pick the words, right, that they want to use for this, because it's not what I would exactly use. Here's a picture of this area. This is an older style kind of picture of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. It gives, these are the walls. Here's the court of Gentiles, the temple, and here's the forts of San Antonio. I think I've shown this one before. Here is the Kidron Valley, and the Kidron, and the reason it's usually called a valley, here's the Hemon. This is Gehenna. That's Gehenna. And here's the walls of the city. Here's the old city, and here is the valley, and this is where the Kidron, torrent is going at this point. And then there is Gethsemane. This is the Mount of Olives, and so this is where that garden is. In this area is what they believe, they think, which I think is pretty accurate. Here is another picture that I really like. See if I can get most of it in here. This is trying to show the movement of Jesus from the whatever. Some of this I think is not quite right. You notice they don't mark Anatolia, the fortress. Here's the temple. Here's the Kidron Valley, and they show this. This is probably a little closer. The upper room is probably lower in here, but it's okay. Here's the pool of Shiloach. This is showing. You notice it says Hasmonean Palace, but Jesus would have gone to Pilate, right, in the pavement, and that was in the Tower of Anatolia. So this isn't quite right. This is where Herod's palace is, although I think it's a little smaller than this. This is the upper city of David. This is the Opal area, Kidron Valley. So, they're showing that Jesus went from the upper room. And remember, I told you that I think that the way it says, let's go into the marketplace, right? And the marketplace is up here. This is the marketplace in the first century. There was another marketplace down here, but it was well known. It was the Pharisaic marketplace. And guess what? It's like Costco or Sam's. You got to have your card. So you can't go in there unless you're a Pharisee or a Sadducee. Actually, even the Sadducees weren't supposed to be using the Pharisaic market. And in the Pharisaic market, the funny thing was you could only use the coinage, the temple coinage, which is really interesting, right? That's a way to make bucks. You trade the, and by the way, you got to realize there was, the Romans had their coins. The Romans would use the Greek coins too, denarius, right, and the coins, but they had the asses, and they had auri, and they had their coins, their type of coins. They're worth a lot of value in that time. The denarius or the Greek coins were worth, had great value. That the Jewish coins were leptons and credentes. Credentes and leptons, which were very low value coins. They're made of copper and we think iron. Remember the widow's mite? The widow's mite was probably an iron coin. There are not a lot of them around. Sometimes you'll find them, but they're iron. So guess what? They rust and turn to dust, right? So the mites and the Roman coins and the Greek coins were all copper, and I think they had some bronze coins, but they were mostly copper and they were silver and gold. Auris were gold. But the Jewish coins were generally bronze or sometimes cheap copper and iron. So you had to trade, if you went to the marketplace and gave them a denarius, they'd take a denarius, but they'd probably look at it and go, the really wise merchants would go, oh yeah, I know what that is, right? But that was a very high value coin. Silver. If you gave them a lepton, a bread would probably cost credentes or a lepton, so it's nothing. Anyway, it's just really interesting. So the market was here. This is the main market. And remember, it said, and I think the upper room was probably down here. So Jesus walked through the city. He said, let's go to the marketplace. And then our dialogues happened. And I think the dialogues happened as they were walking up through, I think they walked through the Pharisaic market. And they were gathering their disciples. And then they're moving up to this market. And they obviously have a lot more disciples, right? And then that would be a really easy go through the courts, through the temple and the courts of the Gentiles, through this gate. And this gate goes right across the Kidron Valley into the Garden of Gethsemane. It's funny, funny, that they put the upper room here in this picture, because I don't think that's exactly where it is. It's okay. They do believe that the house of Annas was there. Caiaphas may or may not have been there. That's historically whatever. These were both probably, remember, these guys are not Pharisees, they're Sadducees. And they're also members of the Sanhedrin. So most likely, they were probably this is the upper city. This is the area where the wealthy and, Pharisees and all those guys are. So anyway, this is an interesting map that shows it. So the Kidron River Valley, the Kidron River is not easily passable. And I believe that the only place, it doesn't show here, but the only place where there were bridges where you could cross or places you could cross was the main road that went, you see this says Bethphage and Bethany, to Bethphage and Bethany. Where else does it go? Any idea? What's over here? Jericho. This is the road to Jericho. So the road to Jericho goes this way, and like I said, one of the only bridges, I don't know if there was a bridge here or a bridge here. Historically, we don't know where everything is. And I haven't gone and examined it myself. We do know, like, for example, this is the refuse gate out of the Optal near the Pool of Shiloh. Pool of Shiloh, they say here. And that's down here, Gehenna, where, they dump the dead bodies and dump garbage and stuff. So, this is really interesting when you start seeing this stuff in perspective. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Now, some people think that the three dialogues we had were the dialogues and the prayers that Jesus made to God that we see in the other Gospels. The other Gospels, it says that Jesus went to the garden. He went to the Mount of Olives. And then we have, the classical thing, Jesus, you take this cup from me, right? Which when we looked at Mark, and then we looked at Mark and Matthew, it doesn't say that at all. Jesus wanted the cup to be taken from the disciples, not from him. Jesus' whole point in death, Jesus' whole point in coming to the world was to die and be resurrected. Why would he pray to himself to take the cup away from him, which would result in the salvation of humanity, right? And the purification of the world from sin? That's just silly. When we looked at the Greek before, and I'm not going to go back and look at that Greek, but we looked at the Greek, we saw that it was not true. And as a kid, I always wondered, why would Jesus not want to do what his purpose was in the world? That makes him too human. If you want a proof if you want an Arian proof, which we're not Arians, we're Nicaeans, right? We believe that Jesus is fully human and fully God. But one of the greatest arguments by the Arians is that Jesus was human more than he was God, or that he was human and not God, right? And one of the ways they proved that is why? He was just some guy that Jesus picked out of, this is the Arian philosophy, that Jesus was this guy, that God picked out of creation, out of the world, to make into the God. That's the Arian view. The Nicene view is Jesus is God, and God is Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and they're all one. And as C.S. Lewis says, the four-dimensional God projected to three dimensions. Anyway, Judas, let's see what this says, because these you're not going to be necessarily happy with the translations or the translators, any of this. This one isn't too bad. Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place where Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. He saw with physical eyes, but Judas, who he was hand over from Perdidos to near give, him to the spot better, because often, many times, led together Jesus thither in that place with or in company with the learners of him. So I don't remember if the other Gospels tell us this specifically, but we don't know this. This is information, right? Did you know that Jesus met with his disciples at the Mount of Olives? And, we're not, John gives us the impression, is this a small group of apostles? Is this 12? How many is this? John gives us the impression that this is a whole lot of folks. This isn't a small group. The other Gospels give us an idea that they're a smaller group or maybe a more specific group. But John's thing is, okay, they had the supper in the upper room, and we know that's more than the 12. And Jesus says, hey, let's get up and go into the marketplace. And then he appears to be collecting apostles or disciples as he's going through the marketplace. And I told you, I think he went through the Pharisaic marketplace, then he went through the regular marketplace, and he's yakking at him. And you notice the final dialogue is at the temple, I think, because that's where he would be going, which is really interesting. So he's picking up disciples there at the temple, and now he's going out to the place that he often went with the disciples, that we didn't know this information before. This is kind of new information to us. Here's the translation. And Judas saw with physical eyes him who he was giving over, because the spot many times Jesus led together in that place in company with his learners. So what is important about this, okay, and Jesus also, which betrayed him, knew the place. What this tells us is Judas was there close enough to Jesus that he identified him, saw him with physical eyes in that place, and he was turning him over because the spot many times led together, so he knew where he was coming. And there is that word, the para word. Remember all the para? Here's paradidomai, but what's the parahethia? The one with Paul, a near throw, a parabolos, para, right? Paul loves that word, and the New Testament authors use para over and over again, because para is a suffix or a prefix used to modify a word to mean close. So close beside. This also gives us the impression, yes, it means to give over, to hand over. In other words, to be close enough to grab a hold or to be it. But that's the point. Let's see. To gather together. This is also interesting because remember the sune words, sune and ago, to lead together, to collect convene. So this is where they led. And by the way, it's a verb of synagogue. So what was Jesus doing at the garden with his learners? Yeah, it was a led together. It's a synagogue. It's a synagogue, right? It's a verb meaning Jesus brought them together for learning. For the Greeks would have used the word, and they did. John used the word. We use it all the time. A symposium, right? John called, when Jesus fed the 5,000, he called it a symposium, a drinking party. No, eating, and it's when the Greeks get together in a symposium to philosophize, to talk, to dialogue, not just to learn. But this is called a synagogue, so it's called a synagogue. It's where they are led together, like we said, to learn. So that's interesting in itself. It says, so Judas came into the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. This is a really, really interesting thing in Greek. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh hither with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Certainly accordingly, Judas, he having taken hold of, Laban, he having taken hold of the Spirion, a coil, literally a Roman military cohort. I'm going to talk about this. And from out from among the high priests, how many high priests are there supposed to be? One, the high priest. And from out of among of the Pharisees, under rowers, subordinates, come here going thither, meta in company with of phanon, of lighteners, torches, people carrying torches or lanterns, and lampum, of a handheld torch, sometimes merely a clay vessel. This is the clay lamps, the lamps of the virgins. A lamp they use a wick saturated with oil, and of implements normally used for warfare, hoplon. Accordingly, Judas, having taken hold of the Roman military cohort, and out from among the chief priests, and out from among the Pharisees' subordinates, he, Judas, was coming thither in company with lighteners and lamps. They use a wick saturated with oil and implements of warfare. These words, and I'm going to try to explain what John is trying to do here. Remember, John is telling the rest of the story, and he's also talking to Romans, and he's talking to the Greeks. And so he's using terms which are very different than the other Gospels. He's using very specific military terms of specific Latin origin. And the cohort...
Other Gospels,
What's that?
Other Gospels kind of lead you to think that they were temple guards.
Yeah.
That went with. And here it makes it sound like they were true Roman cohort.
And I'll show you what a cohort is too. In centurion, I cut the difference. And I'll explain why when we get there. John, some might say, well, John was exaggerating. I don't think he was exaggerating. I think his information may have been more clear. I cut it to, it was a part of it was 2 columns of a century. 2 columns of a century. I'll show you the pictures in a second. I'll try to draw them. I'll use the whiteboard. We'll draw the pictures so you see. But I said it was a centurion and two parts of a cohort, or 2 parts of a century, 2 columns of a century that were there to oversee and make sure that the temple guard did their thing. John is emphasizing, instead of the temple guard or the oversight of the oversight of the temple guard and the Pharisees or the chief priests, he mentions them, but he acts like Judas is leading them. Judas is leading them, but he ain't in charge of nothing, I guarantee you.
Just from the description, they were anticipating a pretty big resistance to this event happening, which was totally off what was really going to happen. They expected there would be a major pushback, and they needed some force to make
Which
sure
I
that
think
they didn't.
supports the idea that there are a lot of people there,
Yes.
Yeah.
not just the 12 disciples.
Yeah.
I wondered why, if they showed up with that much force and there's just Jesus and his 12 disciples, why would they just gather the whole group and arrest them all?
Yeah.
But if there's hundreds around them, that makes a little more sense.
It also makes sense for Peter's resistance, right? If you have 100 people or maybe 200 or maybe more behind you, right? And you pull out your fish knife, which is really interesting how it's described here. It's called a marcon, a small dagger, a fish knife, basically. In the other Gospels, this Gospel, you'll see what it calls it, which is different. But, the fact that he is willing to pull out a knife in the face of Romans, and you see what it says? Lighteners and lamps. Okay, so you got people that can, I think it's really important to note, we say, okay, I got my flashlight, right? How many flashlights do they have? Lighteners, fan on, right? Torches or lanterns. So you got people that have torches or lanterns. Torches and lanterns are things that are used to light, an area, right? And usually military kind of guys might carry a torch or a lantern. They're pretty expensive because what are you going to make a lantern out of, right? Lanterns usually have a covered flame, maybe made of glass or something like that illuminate. The other hand, there were some people that had that were carrying lamp pedon, handheld torch, merely a clay vessel. So one of those little lamps, the one we always picture for the 10 virgins, right? The ones that had and the ones that didn't, and they do they have a lot of oil in them? No, you've seen them, right? The biggest ones maybe hand size. How much light do they put out? You ever tried one? They don't put a lot of light out. It's like, and they're not really used for lighting anything, right? What are they used for? Lighting a fire. Keep the flame, yeah. Keep the flame from burning. It's a cheap way to keep the flame from burning to make sure that the flame doesn't go out so you can relight your fire in the morning, right? So, and they used it, remember, if you remember back when we were studying the Torah, when we looked at the Torah, they had the lamps, the lampstand, we think it's this high, it's really this big. and it's made of gold, which makes it really heavy. But gold is super dense, and so there ain't no way that that would light anything. It was used to keep the flame lit, so that when you wanted to start the sacrifices, you had a fire source. That's the way it worked. So these are guys carrying, and they're probably lighteners with lamps. They may be carrying it from the temple. They may be just people that they grabbed along the way. And it's interesting, it's implements of warfare. Hoplon, yes, which are usually implements of warfare, but that could be anything, right?
Well, Greek soldiers were called hoplites.
Yes, that's correct.
Same concept.
Yep, because they would carry, usually the hoplites would carry potentially the way the Greeks fought. They used short daggers and they used long pikes. The way the Romans fought is the gladius, so a medium length kind of iron sword with pila, and that they had light pila and heavy pila. The light pila were used for throwing, the heavy pila were used for protecting from charge. The Greeks did not usually throw their pilum, their spears. They used the spears to strike the enemy at a distance. So they kept, the hoplites would keep the enemy away from the shields and away from, they always carry a shield too. They very rarely used their daggers. The daggers were kind of a secondary thing. But yeah, hoplon, implements of warfare. Interesting, right? The cohort. I guess I should draw a picture. Let's see. So the best way to get there, I think if I push this button and push this, and I can go to here, and then if I, there's a way to wipe it out. See, how do you clear it? I think you can clear it like this, right? No?
Do the undo.
Undo? Ooh, undo. We gotta undo more than that. Or maybe new whiteboard. Okay, so if you have a century is made of columns, and I don't need to draw all of them, but let's say there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's usually 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 8. So usually 8 by 10, centurion stands here, the signifer stands here, the optio stands here, Tessarius is usually the first guy here. This is the Tessarius. And the Libreus is someplace out here. This is the march order. And then when they go to fight, the centurion moves here, the optio moves back here. But imagine this as about 80. There's 80 about in a century. And you have a century. This is a century. The centuries of the cohort. Let's start with a cohort. So a cohort, there are 5, 6. Yeah, 6. There are 6. So this is, say, you have 1 century, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you have 6 centuries in a cohort. So a cohort is 6 times 80 troops. In the first cohort of the Legion has 10 cohorts in it. So the first cohort to the 10th cohort. And the first cohort has double centuries. So the centuries usually have about 160 troops, legionaries in it, and there's 5. So in centurion, I said that the centurion, Abinadar, took, he, by the way, had a double century because he was in the primus. He was in the primus cohort at that time. So the primus cohort, and I think I said he was like in the 3rd cohort or the 3rd century of the primus cohort is where he was. And so that meant that he would have had 16 times 2, so he would have had 32 troops in double columns. That would have been his double column. So he would have had 32 troops, almost half the size of a legion. So a very large legion. Now, the way John gives it to us, let's see if I go back to here. John says, having taken a hold of the military cohort, and out from among the chief priests and among the Pharisees and subordinates. What he's talking about here is the military cohort, but he doesn't mean it's a whole cohort. This isn't either a primus or even one of the, other 9 cohorts. A cohort would have been, at least 80 times 5 or 80 times 6, which would have been a huge group, right? And the Romans would have never sent that. However, it is possible that the Romans sent the leader of the cohort. The leader of the cohort would have been the first century in the cohort. Now, I'm not sure he did that either. I think what John was indicating is for the Greeks and the Hebrews, the Romans, look, every Roman kid knows what the makeup of the legion. Why? Well, maybe not. I would have thought that every kid in America would want to know the makeup of a battalion, a brigade, a company. I think they did back in the day, platoons, etc., right? I don't think they know today. But during the Roman legion era, I think every red-blooded Roman kid wanted to be a legionnaire if they could, right? It was not an easy thing to do or get into. You had to have you had to have some pull, some ability and skills to be able to get into the legions to begin with. So not everybody was picked, at least in the early empire, and even in the, up to really late Roman legion. Anyway, so what he's trying to say is the authority, and so I think what he's doing is, this is why I made Abinadar out of the first cohort. So he would have been considered a leader, not a leader per se of a cohort, but he would have been considered a leader in the legion and one of the top cohort, right? So I think what John is doing is abbreviating for his readers to let them understand the leadership role. So in other words, did Pilate send the low end or the high end? Yeah, he sent a group that he knew was going to be able to handle it. And if you notice, in the other Gospels, we get a better impression that it was probably the temple guard, but still the temple guard, look at what the temple guard got, right? I mean, some of them have some stuff. The others, though, have like a lamp they just kind of picked up, right? And they have some implements of war, maybe. So, they picked up whatever they had to go with whatever they got to go and get this Jesus guy. So they don't seem very organized. However, if you got a Roman cohort, do you have to be? Nah, the Romans got it all down, baby. They're right there. They're marching. I guarantee you the Romans probably were carrying torches. They didn't play with lanterns. They got torches. They got their gladius. They got the pila. They even have their field packs. They're ready to go. I think it's interesting. And if you look at the derivative of the word, although the word used is a cohort, the specific word is a coil or a spire. So it's a mass of men, a military, they say a military cohort, but also a cohort in common English. Okay, there is a cohort with a C, right? A big C cohort, which means a specific legion organization. There is also a small C cohort, which they have here specifically, is what? Just a part of a Roman legion, right? A group of legionnaires. So I think that although, and I think what's really important or good is when we look at this in what John actually says, a Roman military cohort. John is telling us, okay, here you got the Roman cohort, and then you have these other guys, right? You have and from out among the chief priests, see, Judas having taken hold of the Roman military cohort, and I don't think Judas was in charge of it, but he's there, right? He's leading them. Among the chief priests and the Pharisees' subordinates, Judas was coming in company with lighters of lamps and implements of warfare. The cohort's got all their stuff, they got their thing. What he's trying to say is there's Romans that are overseeing this process, and then there's a whole bunch of people from the temple. And he doesn't identify them as temple guards, but I think that's exactly who they were. If you remember in Centurion, Pilate had given them permission to, as long as Abinadar oversaw them, he allowed them to leave the temple area with their armor and weapons, which was not usually allowed. They did not allow the temple guard to leave the temple area because they were only in charge of the temple and protecting it. So, and that was in Centurion, I showed that as what he called a compromise by Pilate. Yes, sir.
So why do you think they needed Judas? Was it because he knew where the hideout was? I would think the priests and everything had seen Jesus many times, so they knew what Jesus looked like.
This is what I tried to portray. I didn't say it in direct words in Centurion, that Jesus was just a common guy wearing common clothing. Our pictures, right? He's always white. He's wearing white, right? White robes. How do you know it's Jesus? He's got the white robes and they're clean, right? No. Jesus was just a scruffy looking guy. He looked like the guy that came off the farm, like ZZ Top maybe, but his beard is probably dirtier, and does he have a white robe? No, he doesn't have a white robe. He ain't got any white anything in that time or period, right?
Well, he had a pretty impressive robe because they said they didn't want to.
Yeah, he had something nice.
He had his overcloak, which we'll get to, which is really a cool thing. They didn't want to cut it because the problem was if you have a loomed robe and you cut it, what happens? It falls apart. Yeah. So no, we don't want to cut it. You'd actually have to take it to a tailor person to repair it and make it worthwhile. So he had a piece that had been completely woven, and obviously it wasn't really thin woven. It was thick woven. How do you know? Because it would have fallen apart. We'll get to that when we get to that thing. But yeah, he had something that was okay, but would it have been white? Nah, there's no way to keep anything white clean in those days. Yeah, it's not possible.
And it wouldn't necessarily stand out at night. It's like, oh, he's got the one-piece robe.
Yeah. I would have, and probably all the people that were, look, his followers were not low class, they were middle class. Remember how we talked about that? Actually, they're maybe middle to upper middle class because they're fishermen. To us, fishermen are just, that's the bass fisherman dude right on the, no. In those days, a fisherman was an upper middle class or middle class guy. And remember, they had a business going even. They were making big bucks. What's that?
Entrepreneurs.
They were entrepreneurs, yeah. And they weren't taxed to death. Well, kind of they were a little bit. Anyway.
They had a food source.
What's that?
They had food.
And they had food, yeah. So they're, most of the time, so they're eating reasonably well, right? And keeping their families fed. But the big deal here is, I tried to portray in Centurion that Abinadar did not recognize Jesus, even from his youth. And I think what I was trying to do, I didn't talk about it, like describe it in the book per se, but a person who is eating well, who is living well, who is going to, they're not going to age really fast. However, we know that people that aren't eating well, who are potentially on the road a lot, who are having issues and maybe strained, what are they going to look like?
Yeah, a lot older.
lot older, a lot different. So, I just didn't mention it because I didn't think we were mentioning, but I think that he looked just, it's not like he's wearing Pharisaic robes, right? Or Sadducean robes or, special ornaments. I think Jesus just looked like
Making the chosen. He just wears
Yeah. Except maybe even worse. The chosen, they're way too clean as the chosen. These are people
Yeah,
who
that's
did,
true.
their society.
They wash their clothes in a river. You're never going to have anything white after you
The brown
wash
river.
it in a river.
Yeah.
If you wash it. They do show them washing their
Yeah.
clothes.
Uh-huh.
I don't think people wash their clothes that often. In the Victorian era, how often did they wash their clothes in the Victorian era? You tell me.
I don't think they ever did.
Hardly ever, because it's silk and velvet, and so they just kept wearing it, right?
French perfume roll.
After about the third, fourth year, it's like, yeah, you had that for a while. No, they don't know.
They had air conditioning, so they never sweated.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So I think what John is trying to show us or tell us is, okay, you've got these people from the high priest and from the Pharisees that are, kind of disorganized, and you have the Roman legion, and he's trying to say it's a cohort. It's at least led by someone who's in the upper cohort. So, it's handpicked. He's telling you that Pilate did not send some doofus, that he sent a person that was responsible and would make sure that it was done correctly. And that's the question I asked. So he already told me how many priests were there. Yeah, there's supposed to be one. Anyway, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, who is it you want? Oh, this is getting into the really cool stuff. We see this reflected in Mark especially, but John makes it really clear. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things, come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek ye? Jesus, certainly accordingly, he's seeing with physical eyes. So in other words, they're close enough for him to see it, all the whole. They coming or going on or against him. He came or went out, and he made a logical argument to them. Whom you seek, zetite. You seek to plot or worship. Whom do you seek to plot or worship? Remember, that's a really weird word that means to seek, to plot, or seek to worship. Why the Greeks had that word, I have no idea, but it's used a lot, especially in John. Certainly, Jesus seeing the whole with physical eyes, they coming or going against him. He came out and made a logical argument to them. Whom seek you to plot or worship? I did not choose which one for you I would put down, because this word means both. It's a contextual word. So which one do you want? Are they coming to plot or worship?
Kind of like he's giving them a choice.
Yeah, I think he is. I think this is one of those, I told you the Greeks are very concrete, but they got these words, right? And they choose to use these words in the Greek writing that are ambivalent words. And you go, which one is it? And I think the answer is always, well, what do you think, right? I mean, it's not that you have an opinion, but I think it is totally contextual. And the Greeks have this word not to confuse you, but to make you realize that in this group, some of them were seeking to worship him, right? Even those who were coming to get him. And some were seeking to plot against him. But who's who? And what's the difference? Even that's worthy of a philosophical thing, right? I think it's really wild in Greek. So this is the answer. Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said, and Judas, the traitor, was standing there with him. All right. This is really cool stuff. We're getting into some really deep stuff here. They answered him, They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with him. And you notice the he is added in the King James. They indicate it's an added word by having it in italics. Let's see what it really says. They concluded for themselves. So I think this is funny. Jesus says, logical argument. Who do you want? And the author tells us, he doesn't say that they erote, that they immediately answered, that they, replied with a logical argument. They concluded for themselves. So can you see them? They're like, we didn't expect that. No, they knew they were going to get the question, but it's like they didn't have a ready answer. And who's answering for them? Well, the Romans aren't answering. The Romans are going to sit there and like, you idiots, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees and the high priests, we don't know exactly who's there. There are no high priests there. There may be some leading Pharisees, but it says it's the under rowers. It says it's their subordinates, right? So they're subordinates. So who's in charge? I think in Centurion, I say the guy in charge was the head of the cohort, the head of the temple guard. So you have the head of the temple guard who was in charge, and so he's going to be answering him. But you see?
They had to confer on the exact words that they were going to answer.
Yes, and they also had to confer because who's going to say it? Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking too, this whole scenario, this is a touchy situation. Pilate said, last thing he wants is a revolt. And so he's wanting to send the right people, the right muscle, the right people who know who this guy is, and make sure they get the right guy. If they bring back the wrong guy, it's going to be a problem. And so he's nervous about the situation. So he's kind of going to it with everything covered as much as he can. So that's why they're trying to make sure they don't give the wrong answer, because they didn't expect the guy to come straight to him and make it easy on him.
Exactly. I agree. And I do think that they looked at the people in their clothes and said, who is Jesus? And they did, yeah, there may be some people who could pick them out of a crowd or a lineup, but among all these people that look similar and of a similar class of people, right? Like, how do you know? He's got a sign up? He's got a special hat, right? No, who is this Jesus guy? I don't know.
And
Anyway.
we forget with photography being ubiquitous to us, even if they didn't have anything like that. How
Yeah.
do you identify people?
They have graven images either.
Yeah. if you-
And they had no graven images. Yeah. Yeah, let's see your license. Yeah, where's your ID, right? They concluded for themselves to him, Jesus, the Nazarene, which people have confused, and I'm talking about that. It means an inhabitant of Nazareth. So Jesus of Nazareth, you could say. He makes a logical argument to them. Ego imi. Not I am he. Ego imi. Had been made to stand. That's his thing. He makes a logical argument. Ego imi. And then another sentence. Had been made to stand, but Judas, he was turning him over from him in company with of them. So, in other words, Judas is in company with this group that answered. That's the point. They concluded for themselves to him, Jesus the Nazarene. He makes a logical argument to them, I am. But Judas, who was giving him over, had been made to stand in company with them. So, in company with them, is that in company with Jesus, or was that in company with? I think it's in company with those that Jesus was asking. But the important point of this is his statement, ego imi. What did he just say?
I'm God.
I'm God. How do we know that? How do we know that? Look at what happens next. This happens next is really cool. And by the way, I think the Greeks see this as, and I don't want to take anything from it, but I think they see this as high comedy and irony. They do. They see this as high comedy and irony because it's truth. This is really what happened, but Think about this. This is really funny. Jesus says, who do you want? And they go, wait. Give us a second. Let's talk it over. Okay. And Judas, you stand right here, Judas. You make sure we got the right guy, you know. And then they go, okay, we're looking for Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus goes, hey, go in. That's the last thing they expect, right? They don't expect Jesus to go, I am. And not just I am. If he was saying this in Greek, he would have not have said I am. That's not what you say in Greek. In Greek, in English, that is very common. But in Greek, that is not what you say. You would say, is me, or he, I am he, or you would not say I am. You would not use the term I am. There are lots of languages where there are words in ways you just don't say it. You don't say the direct cognitive identity in Greek. It's just not done. But we've seen Jesus do it over and over again. So you say, well, maybe they should expect it. But, look, obviously they got to talk about it to figure it out, right? They drew back and fell to the ground. Now, this is an indicator. This is a great indicator. As soon as he said unto them, I am he, the he is added, right? They went backward and fell to the ground. That's a good translation, actually. Which, how, and what manner, certainly accordingly, he said to them, ego eimi, I am. He said, I'm God. He said, I'm God. All the Hebrews are sitting there. The Romans are like picking their teeth. They're like, nah, they're out of tension. They're doing their thing, right, with their torches and their stuff. They're ready to go. But they're basically picking their teeth, and they're going, yeah, it's dumb Jewish guys, whatever's going on, right? They're dumb Hebrews. But look what happened. Ego eimi, they went off aside or behind, to or into to the back, and they fell on to the ground. So what it's saying, and they want to be very clear, the Greek is making it really clear. They went off aside or behind, to or into the apiso, to the back, and they fell onto the ground. So in other words, they moved back, and then they fell onto the ground. And now, how did they fall? I would say they probably fell on their knees, prostrated themselves, because even though the Greek says I am, he may have used, the I am he may have used, it doesn't tell us this. Why wouldn't John tell us he used Jehovah? Because he couldn't write it. Because the Hebrews did not write the name Jehovah. The best he can do is write in Greek, I am. Because if he wrote Jehovah, they burned the text, right? Because you can't put the name of God on anything. You're not even supposed to say it. I suspect that Jesus said the name of God. And that's why and even if he didn't, the fact that he used ego eimi, they either got it, which I'm not sure that that's smart, this group, right? Or they understood it.
Weren't they the ones who were ready, kind of, well, obviously this is a different place, different group of people, but the same type of people who were ready to stone Jesus when he said it before, because that was the main reason they wanted to kill him.
Yep.
He was blaspheming there, according to them. So.
Yeah, it gets a little complicated because I do not believe that any of this was in Aramaic. You know what I'm saying? I don't believe, if it's Aramaic, it always tells us it was in Aramaic. It says Jesus used Aramaic or Jesus did this, right? And we even get to a point where he says, Lama Lama Eli Sabachthani, which I think is in John, at least the thing. But John was more interested in the Greek and the Roman, right? And I believe, I'm going to throw out this. I think that when you said ego eimi in this period, that the Jews would presume that if you said ego eimi in Greek in a Jewish group, that you were using the name of God, and that's why they wanted to stone him. You didn't have to use the Aramaic or the Hebrew for Jehovah to get in that kind of trouble. That's my opinion. And I'm going to stick to that because I think that whatever Jesus did, it does not say he said it in Aramaic, right? But look at their response. Now, the other thing you could say, and I'll throw this out, we're about out of time, but the thing, what I want you to think about, I think is a really good point. Maybe there's a miracle going. This is Samael. It was the power of Jesus' words. You got a bunch of choices here. I don't think he used Aramaic. I think he was using Greek. The Greek is I am. I think they either figured it out, knew what it was, or it was a Samaeon. A Samaeon meaning that it was the miracle of the power of Jesus when he said, I am, indicated to the people that were there that Jesus was saying, I'm God. They understood that he was saying, I'm God. And they fell back, and I think they prostrated themselves before Jesus. And of course, the Roman legions were like, what's wrong with these guys? Right? It doesn't say they fell down. That's interesting too. And it doesn't say his followers fell down. Interesting stuff here. Thank you, Jesus, for your word. I pray you look after us this week and you bring us all back together safely. In your name we pray. Amen.
See you in July.
Also, it's kind